Hey guys, tonight we are traveling back in time, and deep into the snows of Tsarist Russia. We're going to a world lit by tallow candles and faith, a world of sprawling forests, and whispers in the dark. We're here to uncover the story of a secret society, one that pursued a spiritual path so extreme, so bizarre, that the empire itself tried to erase it from history. Pack your warmest coat and a healthy dose of skepticism, because the weather isn't the only thing that's brutally unforgiving out there. Honestly, your modern sensibilities might not make it through the first village meeting. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments what city you're listening from, and what time it is for you. It's always a quiet thrill for me to see where our little community is spread across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The air is thin and sharp, and it bites at your exposed skin. You find yourself standing on the edge of a vast, silent landscape in the late 18th century. The snow under your felt boots is so deep and so white it seems to swallow all sound, leaving only the crunch of your own steps and the low moan of the wind through skeletal birch trees. This is the Russian Empire. It is a place of profound contradictions. An empire stretching across 11 time zones, ruled by an empress, Catherine the Great, who corresponds with French philosophers about enlightenment, while the vast majority of her subjects are serfs, bound to the land, little more than property. You pull your ruffled cloak tighter. In the distance, the onion domes of an Orthodox church, tipped with gold, catch the weak afternoon sun. The church is the heart of this world. It is a constant, immense presence, inside every home, from the richest nobleman's palace in St. Petersburg to the humblest peasant's hut. Icons of saints stare down from the corners with large, sorrowful eyes. The air is thick with the scent of beeswax and incense, the sound of ancient Slavonic chants echoing a faith that is deeply woven into the soil itself. For most people, this faith is their entire reality. It dictates the seasons of their lives with its cycles of fasting and feasting, its solemn rituals, and its promise of salvation in the next world as a reward for suffering in this one. But if you listen closely, past the tolling of the church bells, you can hear other, quieter currents moving beneath the surface. In the dark corners of taverns, in the steam-filled public bathhouses, and in hushed gatherings around a peasant stove, you hear whispers of a different kind of faith. This is a land that has a long, strange tradition of religious extremism, a quest for a more direct, more personal, more visceral connection to God. It's a spiritual hunger that the grand, formal church sometimes fails to satisfy. This is the culture that gave rise to the Urod IV, the holy fools who would walk through towns in rags, speaking in riddles, believed to be touched by God. This doctor for spiritual intensity has a name, a concept deeply embedded in the Russian soul podvig. It means a feat, a heroic struggle, a spiritual labor undertaken to prove one's devotion. For some, this podvig meant wearing heavy chains under their clothes for a lifetime, a secret burden known only to them and God. For others, it meant abandoning society to live in a cave, subsisting on berries and prayer. It's this background radiation of ascetic passion that makes what is about to happen, well, not entirely unimaginable. And here, as you stand in the deepening twilight, you begin to sense that a new podvig is being born. A new teaching is spreading like a secret fire. Historians to this day still debate what exactly it was about this period that created such fertile ground for what was to come. Was it the crushing hopelessness of serfdom, which made people desperate for a radical path to liberation? Was it a reaction against the reforms of the state, a feeling that the official church was becoming too polished and distant from the raw, bloody core of its own founding story? Or was it simply the charisma of one individual, a compelling voice offering absolute certainty in an uncertain world? The truth is likely a mix of all three. You don't have a name for it yet. This new movement, All you have are rumors. You hear them from a third rapper. His words fogging in the cold air. He speaks of a new prophet, a man who has found the one true way to kill sin forever. Not through prayer, not through fasting, but through a single, decisive act. He calls it a fiery baptism. The phrase hangs in the air, both alluring and terrifying. It's a purification by fire, a final solution to the temptations of the flesh. The trapper won't say more. He makes a sign to ward off evil and hurries away, leaving you alone with the encroaching darkness and the unsettling weight of that phrase. This new flame, you realize, feels different. It feels more dangerous, more absolute than even the wild fervor of the wandering flagellants. You've heard tales of those who seek God through the sting of the whip. This is something else entirely. To understand the fire, you must first understand the tinder. And so, you leave the frozen rack and follow a rumor to a lone barn on the outskirts of a sleeping village. The wind has died down, and the silence is so complete you feel like you could hear a star fall. A thin line of yellow light seeps from beneath the barn door. You push it open just a crack, the old wood groaning in protest, and slip inside, melting into the deep shadows behind a stack of hay bales. The air in here is a stark contrast to the sterile cold outside. It's warm and alive, thick with the smell of livestock, dry hay, and human sweat. In the center of the floor, a single lantern throws long, dancing shadows. About a dozen people are gathered in a loose circle. They are peasants. Mostly you can tell by their simple homespun clothes and work-roughened hands. Men and women, young and old. They are not chanting, not yet. They are just standing, waiting. Their faces filled with a potent mixture of reverence and anticipation. Thing is, you realize, are the Khlysty, the flagellants. You've heard of them. The official church calls them heretics, dangerous deviants who mock God with their bizarre rituals. But looking at their faces, you don't see mockery. You see a desperate, profound yearning. They call their community's ships Kondraty, each one a spiritual ark meant to carry them safely through the sinful flood of the world. Each ship is led by a living Christ and a Mother of God, individuals believed to be living vessels for the divine spirit. The man now stepping into the center of the circle must be their Christ. Hes not physically imposing, but he carries an aura of absolute certainty. He begins to speak, not in a booming sermon, but in a low, rhythmic hum. It's less a speech and more a guided meditation, reminding them of the rotten ends of the flesh and the purity of the spirit, urging them to cast off their worldly burdens and dance for the Holy Spirit. Then, the ritual begins. It is called the rite, i.e., the rejoicing. It starts slowly. The group joins hands, their circle tightening. They begin a simple chant, a repetitive phrase that grows in volume and tempo. They sway. At first, a gentle back and forth motion, but as the chant gets faster, the swaying turns into a spin. Round and round they go, a human whirlpool in the flickering lantern light. Their feet, some bare, some in soft boots, stamp on the dirt floor, raising a fine dust that hangs in the air, catching the light like a golden haze. Faster and faster they turn. The world outside this circle ceases to exist. There is only the motion, the chant, the heat. This is their path to God. They believe that through this ecstatic, dizzying dance, they can bypass the priests, the bishops, the entire gilded structure of the official church. They can open a direct channel to the Holy Spirit, to become possessed by it. As the ecstasy peaks, individuals break from the circle. Overcome, a woman falls to the ground, speaking in what sounds like a cascade of nonsensical syllables, speaking in tongues. An old man stands ramrod straight, his eyes widened unseeing, and begins to prophesy, his voice unnerving and strange, telling of future famines and the fate of kings. Some produce small whips or bundles of twigs and begin to lash themselves, not in a spirit of grim self-punishment, but with a kind of joyous abandon. The sharp sting of the blows meant to awaken the spirit from its fleshly prison. This is the core of their faith, a radical dualism. The body is a cage, a sinful distraction. The soul is a captive spark of divinity. The goal is to mortify the flesh to liberate the spirit. But here's the truly strange part, a detail that is often lost. They didn't just reject the world, they sought to recreate a holy one in their own image. Some Khlysty communities held a startling belief that their mother of God could, through a spiritual union with their Christ, become pregnant and give birth to a new prophet, or even a new Messiah. It was a faith that, while shunning conventional procreation, was still obsessed with the idea of a holy birth. It's a bizarre and potent brew of beliefs, and its influence seeped into the strangest corners of Russian society. To this day, historians fiercely debate the true nature of the infamous Grigory Rasputin's connection to the Khlysty. His wild behavior, his charismatic hold over the royal family, his talk of sinning to find salvation, it all has the distinct flavor of a Raidan, i.e., was he a formal member, a product of one of these very ships, or was he just a fellow traveler? A man whose personal brand of mysticism happened to rhyme with theirs. The evidence is tantalizing but inconclusive. But as you watch the exhausted dancers collapse, spent and serene, you notice one man. He sits apart from the others. He participated. You saw him spinning with as much fervor as anyone, yet on his face, there is not peace, but a deep, simmering frustration. It's as if he's thinking, this is not enough. The ecstasy of the Ride fades. The prophecies are forgotten. The welts from the whips will heal, but the urges of the flesh, the root of all sin, always return. Tomorrow, the desire, the envy, the gluttony, it all comes creeping back. For him, this dance is a temporary solution, a fleeting high. He is hungry for something more, something permanent, a way to kill the beast within, not just stun it for a few hours. A heresy is brewing within this heresy. An idea so radical it will make the Raidan, look like child's play. You are witnessing the moment of schism, the quiet birth of an idea that will soon get a name and a leader. You follow that discontented man. He leaves the barn not with the blissful exhaustion of the other Khlysty, but with a taut, determined energy. He walks for days, a shadow moving through the vastness of central Russia, until he brings you to Oryol province, a region of black earth and deep forests. It is here, in a small and remarkable village, that you finally meet him. His name is Kondraty Selivanov, and to look at him, you wouldn't guess he was about to ignite a spiritual firestorm that would last for over a century. He is not a grand, imposing figure. He's a peasant, probably in his 30s or 40s, with the weather-beaten face and calloused hands of a man who has worked the land his whole life. There's a quiet intensity in his eyes, a gaze that seems to look right through you, weighing the state of your soul. He doesn't speak much, but when he does, his voice is low and raspy, yet carries an unnerving authority. People fall silent to listen. This is the man who looked at the Khlyst's ecstatic dancing and thought, a noble effort, but ultimately, a failure. He saw their ritualized flagellation as a half measure, a way to temporarily chastise the body without ever truly conquering it. The story of his own origins is deliberately shrouded in fog, a common tactic for charismatic leaders who want their followers to focus on the message, not the man. The narrative he and his followers would later construct is both simple and epic. He was, he claims, just a wandering peasant who, in a moment of profound spiritual crisis, received a direct revelation, not from an angel, not in a dream, but from the Son of God himself. The message was brutal in its simplicity, the root of all human sin, from the moment of Adam and Eve's fall, was lust. Every other sin, greed, pride, envy, was just a bitter fruit grown from that one poison seed. Prayer, fasting, even the Khlyst's ecstatic dance, were like trimming the branches of a weed. To be truly saved, you had to tear it out by the root. You watch him as he gathers his first few disciples. They are not nobles or merchants. They are people like him, poor, In nature it serves people at the very bottom of society's ladder. He meets them in fields, in small forest clearings, away from the prying eyes of the village priest or the local landowner. He doesn't offer them comfort. He offers them a terrible, beautiful certainty. He tells them that the world is drowning in filth, and the official church is a gilded ship full of holes. Salvation, he preaches, requires a radical act of self-sacrifice, an imitation of the angels, who are neither male nor female. A final, irreversible step that would burn away desire forever. Here we encounter one of the core and most debated mysteries of the movement Selivanov's own story, according to the Skoptsy faith that will spring from him. Selivanov himself had already undergone this ultimate sacrifice. He was the first. He had performed the fiery baptism upon himself, becoming a living testament to its purifying power. But historians have a different view, and the evidence is murky at best. There is a strong counter-argument, supported by some government records from his later interrogations, that Selivanov himself was never actually castrated. This school of thought suggests he was a brilliant and charismatic ideologue, a dry leader who preached the virtues of a sacrifice he himself never made. Was he a true believer who led by example, or a master manipulator who understood the power of an ideal? Even if he didn't embody it personally, we may never know for sure. What we do know is that his message resonated with a terrifying power. Imagine you are a peasant from that time. Your life is one of back-breaking labor, constant hunger, and utter powerlessness. The church tells you to be patient, to endure, and to hope for a reward in heaven. But Selivanov offers something else. He offers you a way to seize control of your own salvation. Right here, right now, he offers you a way to become something more than human, a white dove, pure and unstained by the filth of earthly life. He promises that by making this one great sacrifice, you will not only guarantee your place in heaven, but you will become part of an elite, a secret brotherhood of saints walking the earth. He doesn't just preach theology, he speaks in vivid, rustic metaphors that his audience understands. He calls the genitals the key to the abyss, the very thing that locks you into the endless, miserable cycle of birth, sin, and death. To throw away the key is to lock the door on hell forever. He is a master of this kind of simple, powerful, and deeply unsettling imagery. You see it in the eyes of his listeners. You see the dawning realization, the mixture of horror and fascination. For a person whose entire existence is defined by the body, the aching body, the hungry body, the aging body, the idea of finally, decisively conquering it holds a terrifying appeal. Kondraty Selivanov is not just a preacher, he is a psychologist of the desperate soul. And he has just found the words to unlock a very dark door. The idea has been planted. The door has been unlocked. Now, you're about to witness it being thrown wide open. You huddle in the corner of a dimly lit peasant hut, the kind with a huge clay oven that takes up a quarter of the room, radiating a dry, oppressive heat. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, apprehension, and something else, a kind of solemn, almost festive, intensity. This is where it happens. This is where the core doctrine of Selivanov's teaching, a concept only whispered about in the woods and fields, becomes a physical reality. They call it the Kondraty, the fiery baptism. It's a name deliberately chosen for its biblical resonance, echoing John the Baptist's promise of a Messiah who would baptize with the Holy Spirit and with fire. But Selivanov has reinterpreted this. The baptism of water, he taught, cleanses you of past sins, but the baptism of fire that prevents future sins. It's a preventative measure, a final, radical surgery on the soul, performed upon the body. The person at the center of this ritual is a young man, barely out of his teens. He lies on a simple wooden table, his face pale but resolute in the flickering candlelight. Around him stand a half-dozen of Selivanov's earliest and most devout followers. Selivanov himself is here, not as an executioner, but as a spiritual guide, a calming presence. He murmurs prayers, his voice a steady drone that fills the small space. He speaks of the liberation to come, the shedding of the serpent's skin, the final victory over the devil who resides in the flesh. He is reframing this act not as one of violence or loss, but as one of ultimate empowerment and purification. The tool used for this ritual is shockingly mundane. It's not some elaborate, sinister instrument forged in the fires of hell. More often than not, it was a simple farming tool, a sharpened knife used for gilding livestock, or even a piece of heated metal, like a sickle or a shard of glass. The use of fire or heated metal is where the name fiery baptism likely comes from, as cauterization was a crude but effective method of stopping the bleeding. The procedure itself is quick, brutal, and performed without any form of anesthetic beyond the powerful psychological cocktail of faith, chanting, and group pressure. To us, it is a scene of unimaginable horror. But to them, in this moment, it is a sacrament. It is the holiest of acts. Fascinating, and frankly bizarre bit of lore associated with this ritual is what they did with the surgically removed parts. They were not discarded. In some Skoptsy communities, they were treated as holy relics. They might be dried, preserved, and sometimes even ground into a powder. This powder would then be mixed with water or kv as a fermented rye drink and consumed by the faithful. They believed that by ingesting the physical remnants of this sacrifice, they could partake in its spiritual power, a kind of dark, twisted version of the Christian Eucharist. It was a way for the community to collectively share in the grace of an individual's podvig. As the ritual concludes, the atmosphere in the room shifts. The tension breaks, replaced by a strange, quiet joy. The young man is helped from the table, wrapped in clean linen, and cared for with a tenderness reserved for a newborn. He is no longer just a peasant boy named Ivan or Dmitri. He is now a beloved Golub, a white dove. He has joined the ranks of the angels. He is revered. The other members of the community approach him with awe, touching his arm, congratulating him on his victory. He has crossed a threshold from which there is no return, and in doing so, has become a living saint in their eyes. Historians still debate the precise origins of this practice. Selivanov and his followers claimed it was a direct revelation, a new covenant with God. But scholars see echoes of older, pre-Christian traditions and other religious movements. Castration as a form of religious devotion wasn't entirely new to the world. The Galli, ancient priests of the goddess Cybele in Rome, famously castrated themselves in a state of religious ecstasy. Some early Christian thinkers, like the influential theologian Origen, were rumored to have taken Matthew 19:12 there be eunuchs, which have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake literally. Though this is heavily contested, was Selivanov aware of these precedents? It's highly unlikely. It's more probable that this was a case of radical ideas converging that in a state of extreme religious fervor, a human mind, desperate to solve the problem of sin, arrived at the same shocking, physical conclusion that others had centuries before. What was unique here was how Selivanov systemized it, turning it from a rare, individual act of devotion into the central, defining sacrament of an entire religious movement. The first fiery baptism is complete. The first white dove is ready to take flight. The movement now has a founder, a core doctrine, and its first initiated members. But a handful of white doves in a hut does not make a sustainable community. To survive in the hostile environment of Tsarist Russia, they needed structure. They needed a sanctuary. And so, you watch as Selivanov, with remarkable organizational skill, begins to build his first ship. The term, you'll remember, is borrowed directly from the Khlysty. The Khlysty, or ship, is a beautiful and potent metaphor for a people who see themselves as a spiritual family, navigating the treacherous waters of a sinful world. But Selivanov's ships would be built to a different blueprint, designed for a much longer, more arduous voyage. The first one takes shape in the city of Tambov, not as a single building, but as a network of believers woven into the fabric of the town itself. You find yourself in the bustling marketplace of Tambov. All around you is the normal chaos of 18th century urban life, merchants hawking their wares, chickens scattering underfoot, the smell of baked bread mixing with the stench of the gutter. It's the perfect place to hide in plain sight. You see a man selling leather boots. His neighbor is a tailor, meticulously stitching a waistcoat. Across the way, a woman sells pickled vegetables from a large wooden barrel. To an outsider, they are just shopkeepers, artisans, neighbors, but you can see the subtle signs that connect them. A shared glance, a quiet, coded phrase exchanged over a transaction, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. They are all members of the same ship. At the helm of this ship is the KORMKYYY, the helmsman. This is often a charismatic and trusted leader, perhaps one of the first to have undergone the fiery baptism alongside Selivanov. He is the local authority, the one who organizes the secret meetings, vets potential new members, and manages the community's resources. The ship itself is more than just a congregation, it's a fully fledged commune, a mutual aid society operating in the shadows. This is the genius of their early structure. Joining the Skoptsy wasn't just a spiritual decision, it was a practical one. Imagine you are a new convert. You've just made the ultimate sacrifice. You are now a white dove. You can no longer marry or have a family in the traditional sense. You are an outcast from conventional society. But within the ship, you are not an outcast, you are a hero. And you are taken care of. If you need a place to live, the ship provides one. If you need work, another member, like that bootmaker or tailor, will take you on as an apprentice. If you fall ill, the community nurses you back to health. They have created a closed economic and social loop, a parallel society with its own safety net. This was an incredibly powerful incentive for recruitment, especially among the poor and disenfranchised. One of the most curious aspects of these early ships was their internal social structure. It was a spiritual meritocracy. Your status within the community was directly tied to the sacrifice you had made. Those who had undergone the full fiery baptism were the white doves, the elite, the full members. They held the positions of authority and were treated with the utmost reverence. But not everyone who was drawn to the faith was ready or willing to take that final step immediately. So they created intermediate ranks. You could join the ship as a novice, attend the secret meetings, and contribute to the community, all while preparing yourself for the ultimate trial. This created a pathway, a ladder of spiritual ascent that kept new people engaged and moving towards the movement's core ideal. Historians are still somewhat divided on just how formalized these early structures were. Did Selivanov hand down a detailed, hierarchical blueprint from the very beginning, like a corporate founder drafting an org chart, or did the structure evolve more organically, with each ship adapting its own rules and roles based on local needs and the personality of its helmsman? The latter seems more likely. The Skoptsy were, by necessity, a decentralized network. Each ship was a semi-autonomous cell, which made the movement incredibly resilient. If one ship was discovered and its leaders arrested, the others could continue to operate independently. It was a guerrilla faith, perfectly adapted to its environment. As you stand in the Tambov market, watching this secret world operate under the noses of the authorities, you realize the true strength of what Selivanov has built. He hasn't just offered a radical theology, he has offered a new family, a new identity, and a new home. He has created a place for people who felt they had no place. The ship is more than an ark, it's a fortress. And from within its invisible walls, the Skoptsy are preparing to not just survive, but to expand. They are about to start sending out missionaries, fishermen of men, to bring more lost souls aboard. The ship is built into float, but a ship needs a crew. Now you'll see how they get one. The process of recruitment, of pulling people from the worldly life into their secret society, was a masterclass in psychological persuasion. It wasn't about shouting sermons on street corners. It was a slow, deliberate, and deeply personal process. You watch as a trusted member of the Tambopship, a man well called Brother Ivan, goes about his work. Ivan is a white dove, and he carries the quiet confidence of a man who believes he has conquered death itself. His target is a young apprentice in his own workshop, a boy named Pavel. The recruitment begins not with theology, but with kindness. Ivan is the best master Pavel has ever had. He is patient and fair. He pays a decent wage. And when Pavel's mother falls ill, Ivan gives him extra money for medicine. No questions asked. He establishes a bond of trust and gratitude. This is the first and most crucial step. The Skoptsy understood that people are rarely argued into a new belief system, but they can be loved into one. Next comes the sowing of dissatisfaction. In quiet moments, while they work together, Ivan starts to talk. He speaks of the sinfulness of the world outside their workshop. He points out the town drunkard, the corrupt tax collector, the nobleman who flaunts his wealth while others starve. He speaks of the futility of it, all the endless cycle of working, marrying, having children who will also work and suffer, and then dying. Is this all God intended for us? Pavel, he asks, his voice soft and sorrowful. A life of dirt and disappointment, only to be food for worms. He never mentions his own faith. Not yet. He just holds up a mirror to the grim realities of peasant life and plants a seed of divine discontent in Pavel's mind. Once the seed has sprouted, once Pavel starts echoing these frustrations himself, Ivan moves to the next stage, the introduction of a secret hope. One evening, he invites Pavel to his home for a meal. After they've eaten, he locks the door. He leans in close, his voice barely a whisper. He tells Pavel that there is a way out, a secret pole, a community of true believers who have found a way to live like angels on earth. He speaks of a world free from sin, from want, from the agony of desire. He describes the ship not as a place of sacrifice, but as a place of ultimate peace and security. It's an exclusive club, he implies, and Pavel is special. He has a pure soul. He might be one of the chosen. The allure of being chosen is incredibly powerful for a young man like Pavel, who has been told his entire life that he is nothing. The idea that he might be spiritually exceptional is intoxicating. This is the moment when the Holy Spirit, or SVYA2KH, is first introduced as an active force. The Skoptsy believed the Holy Spirit personally guided them in identifying potential converts. Ivan tells Pavel, "The Holy Spirit rested upon you. I saw it. That is why I am speaking to you now." This reframes the recruitment as a divine calling, not a human choice, making it much harder to refuse. A particularly strange and little-known recruitment tool they used was the spiritual marriage. Sometimes, a potential male convert would be paired with a white dove sister from the community. They would live together in a celibate partnership, a spiritual marriage, to test the man's resolve and slowly acclimate him to a life without physical intimacy. The woman acted as his mentor and guide, a living embodiment of the purity he was striving for. It was a kind of trial period, a way to experience the angelic life before making the final, irreversible commitment. Now, Ivan invites Pavel to a secret meeting. Parade and IE. But this is not the wild, ecstatic dance of the KHLYS. The Skoptsy ride in IE was often a more solemn affair. There would be chanting, of course, and prophecies, but the central focus was on the testimonies of the white doves. One by one, they would stand and speak of the peace they had found, the clarity of mind, the freedom from the torment of lust. They described their old lives as a fever dream, and their new life as a cool, quiet dawn. It's a room full of living, breathing advertisements for the faith. The historical debate here centers on the element of deception. Were the Skoptsy honest about the fiery baptism from the outset, or did they hide the full reality of the castration until a convert was too deeply enmeshed in the community to back out? The evidence suggests it varied. Some accounts from former members claim they were only told about the need for purity and chastity, with the surgical reality being revealed much later. Others state that the fiery baptism was presented up front as the glorious, ultimate goal. It likely depended on the recruiter and the perceived nature of the recruit. For someone like Pavel, young and idealistic, they might present the full, challenging picture. For an older, more hesitant person, they might use a more gradual approach. Pavel is mesmerized. He sees a community bound by a powerful secret. He sees people who are poor in worldly goods but rich in spirit. He sees a path out of the mud. He leaves the meeting with his head spinning. The whispers of the Holy Spirit now sounding very much like his own desires for a better, purer life. The hook is set. The slow, careful process of reading him in has begun. Pavel is now inside the ship, a novice sailor on a strange sea. He has seen the promised land, but he hasn't yet paid the full price of admission. You are now about to learn the specific currency of this kingdom. The Skoptsy had a clear, tiered system for their ultimate sacrament, a way of formalizing the journey from novice to perfected saint. They called these stages the seals, a term taken from the Book of Revelation, imbuing their physical acts with apocalyptic significance. To be sealed was to be marked as one of God's own, protected from the coming judgment. The first step, the entry-level sacrifice, was known as the lesser seal. For a man like Pavel, this meant castration, the removal of the testicles. The procedure was exactly as you witnessed before, a swift, brutal act, framed as a sacred ritual. Once this was done, Pavel was considered to have put the first seal upon his flesh. He had taken a decisive step. He had, in their view, killed the factory of sin, though not yet removed the tool. After the lesser seal, he was no longer a novice. He was a full member of the community, but not yet at the highest echelon. He was a flagellants, a half-weight dove. He would be celebrated. He would be cared for during his recovery. He would now be privy to the deeper secrets of the community, but he would also be under constant observation and gentle pressure to complete his journey. The elders would tell him, "You have chained the beast, brother, but you still carry the chain. The beast is weakened, but not dead. True peace comes only when it is gone entirely." The final, ultimate step was the greater seal. This involved the removal of the penis itself, an act known as penectomy. This was the point of no return, the absolute eradication of all potential for sexual function. A man who underwent this was considered to have achieved the highest possible state of earthly purity. He was a true white dove, a living angel. He was seen as having fully emulated Christ. In their theology, was the first and greatest of the Skoptsy. In some communities, those who had taken the greater seal were given special white robes to wear during the raid, signifying their elevated status. They were the spiritual aristocracy. This two-step process was psychologically brilliant. The lesser seal was a massive, life-altering commitment. Having already sacrificed so much, the pressure to finish the job and achieve the ultimate glory of the greater seal would have been immense. It created a powerful internal momentum. To remain a half-dove was to live in a state of spiritual incompleteness, a constant reminder that a further, more perfect state was attainable. A little known and rather grim detail about these procedures is that the Skoptsy developed their own class of folk surgeons. Over time, certain members of the community became specialists in performing the seals. They developed a practical, if crude, knowledge of anatomy and how to manage the immediate aftermath. They weren't trained doctors, of course, but through practice, they became chillingly proficient. These operators were highly respected within the community, seen as priests performing a holy sacrament. They were the gatekeepers to the angelic state, and their hands were considered blessed. For women, the path was parallel, though anatomically different. The female equivalent of the seals was known as mastectomy. The lesser seal for a woman was the removal of her nipples. This was seen as a way to destroy the sensual, unnurturing aspects of her femalines. It was a horrifying act, intended to make her body barren and unappealing, thus purifying her. The greater seal for women was the complete removal of one or both breasts. In some of the most extreme cases, there are accounts of even more extensive mutilations of the external female genitalia, though these seem to have been less common. A woman who had undergone this was a Khlysty, a female dove, and was held in the same high esteem as the male white doves. She was a spiritual sister, a perfected being who had triumphed over her eminent nature, which they, like many ascetic traditions, equated with temptation and carnality. The historical debate here is a subtle but important one. Was this two-tiered system a deliberate, early invention of Selivanov, or did it evolve over time as a practical measure? Some scholars argue that in the very beginning, there was only one act, the complete and total removal, the greater seal. They suggest the lesser seal was introduced later as a more accessible entry point, a way to lower the barrier to entry and increase recruitment. If a potential convert was terrified by the prospect of the greater seal, the lesser seal could be presented as a more manageable first step. This theory paints the Skoptsy leadership as not just fanatics, but as pragmatic strategists, willing to adapt them as sacred rituals to ensure the growth and survival of the movement. Pavel now faces this choice. He has been accepted, he is cared for, but he feels the constant, unspoken expectation. He sees the serene faces of the white doves and the reverence they command. The whispers have started again, not from Brother Iden, but from inside his own head. The beast is chained, but it is not dead. The journey is not over. The greater seal awaits. You turn your attention from Pavel and his solemn deliberations to the other side of the communal room. Here, the women of the ship sit together, mending clothes, preparing food, their movements economical and serene. From a distance, they look like any other group of devout women in a deeply religious society. But you know that for many of them, their simple peasant blouses hide the evidence of a sacrifice just as profound, and in some ways more complex, than that of their male counterparts. These are the Khlysty, the female doves, the white dove sisters. Their journey into the faith was often different from the men's. You watch one of them, a woman named Elia. She came to the Skoptsy not with a young man's abstract terror of sin, but with a woman's concrete terror of the world. In the Russia of this era, a woman's life was a perilous one. She was the property of her father, then the property of her husband. Her body was not her own, it was a vessel for childbirth and a tool for labor. The threat of unwanted pregnancy, the dangers of childbirth, the constant vulnerability to male violence, these were not theological concepts, but daily realities. For a woman like Elia, the Skoptsy offered a radical, almost unthinkable, escape. Their theology, while brutal, contained a kernel of astonishing liberation. It told her that her body, the source of all her worldly suffering and subjugation, could be the very key to her spiritual freedom. By embracing the seals, she wasn't just rejecting sin, she was rejecting the entire patriarchal structure that defined her existence. She was refusing to be a wife, refusing to be a mother, refusing to be an object of desire. She was, in a very real sense, declaring sovereignty over her own flesh, even if that declaration was written in the language of mutilation. As you learned, the path for women mirrored the men's. The lesser seal, the removal of the nipples, was often the first step. The greater seal, a full mastectomy, was the ultimate goal. The act was performed with the same ritual solemnity, the same framing of purification and rebirth. When a woman emerged from this ordeal, she was revered. She had become a Khlysty. She was no longer defined by her relationship to a man, but by her relationship to God. Within the ship, she could be a leader, a prophetess, a respected elder. She achieved a level of autonomy and spiritual authority that was utterly inaccessible to her sisters in the outside world. Here you see the central, painful paradox of the Skoptsy woman. She was liberated from her womanhood by destroying it. She escaped the cage of female biology by burning the cage down. It's a transaction that is difficult for the modern mind to comprehend, but in the context of her time, it held a powerful, tragic logic. One of the most fascinating and little-known roles for these women was that of the Bogorodice, or Mother of God. Each major Skoptsy ship had one, unlike the Khlysty, who sometimes believed their Mother of God could conceive a new Messiah. The Skoptsy Bogorodice was a purely symbolic figure. She was typically an older woman, one who had undergone the greater seal long ago and was known for her wisdom and piety. She was the spiritual mother of the community, the living embodiment of the divine feminine. But a divine feminine that had been deliberately and permanently separated from fertility and sexuality. She would lead the women in their charts, interpret dreams, and offer prophecies. In a world that valued women almost exclusively for their ability to bear children, the most powerful woman in the Skoptsy world was powerful precisely because she could not. This leads to a fierce and ongoing debate among scholars of history and gender. Were the Skoptsy women empowered rebels or tragic victims? One school of thought argues that this was a form of proto-feminism, a radical rejection of patriarchal norms. These historians would say that women like any consciously chose this path as the only available means to live a life of intellectual and spiritual independence. Another school of thought argues the opposite, that this was the ultimate expression of internalized misogyny. They contend that the Skoptsy faith, founded by a man and centered on a male savior narrative, simply convinced women that their bodies were inherently evil and that the only path to holiness was through self-destruction. The truth, as always, is probably somewhere uncomfortably in the middle, a complex tapestry of agency and coercion, liberation and mutilation. You watch Anya as she speaks with Pavel. There is a calm, uncomplicated affection between them, a fraternal bond, all the tension, the coitus, the power dynamics that would define a conversation between a young man and a young woman in the outside world. They're gone. They are, in their own eyes, equals. They are brother and sister in a family of angels. The Skoptsy didn't just unmake individuals, they unmade the very concepts of man and woman, replacing them with a single, purified category, the dove. The social results are undeniable. But, as you look at Anya's serene face, you can't help but wonder about the scars she carries, and the terrible, silent price of her purity. You've seen the spiritual heart of the Skoptsy, the fervent faith and the brutal sacrifices that fuel it. Now, prepare for a surprise. This secret society of self-mutilating ascetics was also, paradoxically, a financial powerhouse. You leave the hushed intensity of the ride and step into a different part of the ship's operations. Its bustling and deeply hidden economic engine. You are about to meet the bankers of the underworld. The scene shifts to a back room of a prosperous-looking tailor shop in St. Petersburg, a city far more cosmopolitan and wealthy than the rural villages where the faith was born. The man sitting behind a heavy oak desk is a Skoptsy, a white dove who underwent the greatest seal decades ago. He is meticulously dressed. His fingers, though ink-stained, move with precision as he calculates figures in a ledger. He is the local KACHAA, the treasurer of his ship. And the ship in a major city like this isn't just a commune, it's a diversified business enterprise. The Skoptsy discovered very early on that their unique lifestyle gave them a massive competitive advantage in business. Think about it. A Skoptsy craftsman or merchant has no family to support. He has no wife or children demanding his time or money. He has no expensive vices. He does not drink. He does not gamble. He does not carouse. Every waking hour can be devoted to his trade, and every kopeck earned, beyond what is needed for simple subsistence, goes directly back into the community's coffers. They became the ultimate capitalists, driven by a spirit of collective, rather than personal, enrichment. You watch as people come and go from this backroom. A fellow Skoptsy, a jeweler, comes to deposit his week's profits. He is followed by an Skoptsy merchant, a worldly man, who has come for a loan. This is the secret. The Skoptsy ship, with their ever-growing pool of capital, became informal banks. They were known throughout the commercial underground as a source of reliable, if discreet, financing. Need to buy a new shipment of tea from China, the local priest might give you a lecture, and the official banks might drown you in paperwork and demand exorbitant interest. But the Skoptsy, they would give you a loan quickly, quietly, and often at a more competitive rate. They were shrewd investors. They understood business, and they had an uncanny knack for backing the right ventures. Their own members, disciplined and incredibly hard-working, ran some of the most successful businesses in their fields, from goldsmithing and money changing to running fleets of horse-drawn cabs. A particularly weird and specific niche they dominated in some cities was the bathish. This might seem strange for a group obsessed with purity, but it was a perfect business. Bathishes, or bonyas, were central to Russian life, and they were profitable. Owning and operating them gave the Skoptsy a constant stream of income and, perhaps more importantly, a perfect, private place for their own secret meetings and rituals. The steam and noise of the public sections provided excellent cover for the secret gatherings held in the private rooms. This accumulation of wealth was not for personal luxury. The treasurer behind the desk lives as simply as any other member. The money served two main purposes. First, it was a social safety net, providing for the welfare of every member of the ship. Second, and more importantly, it was a tool for expansion. The wealth was used to buy property, to set up new businesses that could employ more converts, and to fund the travel of their missionaries. They would sometimes use their financial power to quite literally buy people out of servitude. A landowner in debt might be willing to release a serf, for a whole family of serfs if a benevolent society mysteriously appeared and paid off their bond. That family, now indebted to the Skoptsy, would be prime candidates for conversion. The exact nature and scale of this Skoptsy shadow economy is, of course, a matter of historical debate. Because it was an underground and often illegal operation, they kept meticulous records but also knew how to hide them. Did they have a centralized banking system connecting the ships across the empire? A kind of Skoptsy Federal Reserve, or was each ship's treasury largely independent? The evidence points more towards a decentralized model, but with a high degree of trust and cooperation between the treasurers of different ships. A ship in Moscow might provide a capital injection to help a fledgling shipowner could get started. You watch as the treasurer closes his ledger. The candlelight glints off the gold coins he locks away in a heavy iron box. It strikes you then the incredible irony of it all. They cut away the parts of the body that create new life. Yet they were masters at making inert gold multiply. They preached a rejection of the material world. Yet they became incredibly adept at manipulating it. They had created a self-perpetuating system where spiritual fervor and financial acumen fed each other. The more converts they made, the more workers they had. The more workers they had, the more wealth they generated. And the more wealth they generated, the more power they had to protect themselves and attract even more converts. This was not just a cult, it was a corporation. And business was booming. The iron box is locked. The wealth is secure. But this leads to a fascinating and fundamental problem created by their own core belief system. You're sitting with an aging Skoptsy jeweler. His name is Fyodor. His hands, they're wrinkled, are still steady as they set a tiny gemstone into a silver earring. He owns this shop. He built it from nothing, over 50 years of painstaking work. It's a profitable business, and by the standards of the world, he is a wealthy man. But Fyodor is a white dove. He has no children. He has no wife, no heir, no one to pass his life's work on to. So what happens to it all when he dies? This is the brilliant, self-sustaining loop at the heart of the Skoptsy economic model: wealth without heirs. In the outside world, wealth is dynastic. A father passes his farm, his business, his fortune, to his son. It stays within a bloodline. But in the Skoptsy world, there are no bloodlines. This seemingly huge disadvantage was turned into their greatest collective strength. When a member like Fyodor passes away, his death is treated not as a end, but as a final contribution to the community. There is no messy battle over inheritance, no squabbling relatives. The process is simple and automatic. Everything he owns: the shop, the tools, the inventory of jewels, the savings hidden under the floorboards reverts directly to the ship. It is his final, and often his largest, tithe, his personal wealth, accumulated over a lifetime, is socialized. It is absorbed back into the communal treasury. The KAZ managed by the ship's treasurer. You can see the power of this system. Instead of being diluted and dispersed with each generation, the wealth of the Skoptsy community could only grow. It was a one-way street. Money and assets flowed in, both from the profits of the living and the estates of the dead, but they never flowed out to worldly heirs. The ship's capital was like a snowball rolling downhill, constantly growing larger and more powerful. The individual dies, but the corporation lives forever. This had a profound psychological effect on the members. It fostered a deep sense of collective identity. Fyodor isn't working for himself, he's working for the eternal life of the community. His legacy isn't a child, it's the continued strength and prosperity of the ship that will sail on long after he's gone. This gave his labor a holy purpose. The act of making money, so often condemned as a sinful distraction, was transformed into a sacred duty. His industriousness was a form of worship, as vital to the community's survival as the chanting at a ride in IE. Of course, this wasn't always a smooth process. A particularly strange and little-known issue they had to navigate was legal challenges from the outside world. Imagine a man joined the Skoptsy, but he still had a worldly brother or cousin. When the Skoptsy member died, that relative might show up with a lawyer, demanding their rightful inheritance according to state law. The Skoptsy became very adept at navigating these legal grey areas. They would use pre-signed wills, property deeds held in the name of the community helmsman, and a network of sympathetic or bribed local officials to ensure the assets stayed within the ship. They had to be as skilled in legal maneuvering as they were in money lending. Historians are still piecing together the full extent of the Skoptsy's wealth, but the anecdotal evidence is staggering. By the mid-19th century, some ships were rumored to hold millions of rubles in their collective treasuries. They owned apartment buildings in major cities, strings of businesses, and vast tracts of land often held through trusted non-Skoptsy intermediaries. There's an ongoing debate about whether this immense wealth ultimately corrupted the movement. Did the later generations of Skoptsy join for the promise of salvation, or for the promise of a comfortable, secure life within a prosperous commune? Did the focus shift from the fiery baptism of the soul to the balancing of the ledger? Some sources from the period suggest a growing worldliness, with leaders more concerned with investment returns than with prophecies. Others argue that the financial success was always seen as merely a tool, a means to a spiritual end, and that the core faith remained pure. As Fyodor puts the finishing touches on the earring, he smiles a thin, content smile. He knows this beautiful, valuable object he has created will soon be sold. The profit will go into the ship's coffers, and that money might be used to fund a missionary's journey to Siberia, or to provide a safe house for a new convert, or to make a loan that will indebter a local official to their cause. He looks around his prosperous shop, not with the pride of ownership, but with the satisfaction of a steward. He is a temporary caretaker of a small piece of the kingdom of God on earth. He has no son, but he has hundreds of brothers and sisters, and his inheritance will be their survival. The wealth is growing, the ships are multiplying, and the movement is gaining a dangerous level of confidence. No, the story takes a turn from the merely radical to the truly audacious. You find yourself back in St. Petersburg, but this time you're not in a clandestine workshop. You're standing in a crowd, listening to a Skoptsy preacher. HES not whispering in the back alley anymore. HES speaking boldly, though still to a select group, and the message HES delivering is no longer just about personal salvation. It's about to collide with the highest levels of imperial power in a way that will shake the very foundations of the state. The preacher is telling a story. It's a story many in Russia knew, a tale of political intrigue and unresolved mystery. He talks about Tsar Peter II, the unfortunate husband of Catherine the Great. Peter II had ruled for only 6 months in 1762 before being overthrown in a coup led by his own wife. Shortly after, he died under very mysterious circumstances. The official story was that he died of hemorrhoidal colic, a diagnosis so convenient it was practically a joke. Most people assumed he was assassinated, a loose end tied up to secure Catherine's throne. But in a land that loves a good conspiracy theory, a powerful legend was born: the Redeemer Tsar. The story went that the good Tsar Peter hadn't really died. He had escaped his assassins and was now wandering the land as a peasant, waiting for the right moment to return, reclaim his throne, and deliver his people from the clutches of the wicked nobles and his usurping German wife. This myth was incredibly potent. It fueled numerous peasant uprisings, most famously the massive Pugachev Rebellion, which was led by a Cossack who claimed to be the returned Peter III. Now the Skoptsy preacher takes this explosive national myth and fuses it with his own faith. He leans in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. He tells the enthralled crowd that the Redeemer Tsar has returned. He is alive, and he is one of them. In fact, he is their leader. He is their founder. Kondraty Selivanov, the preacher declares, is the miraculously escaped Tsar Peter III. This is a bombshell, a stroke of theological and political genius. Suddenly, Selivanov is no longer just a peasant prophet. He is royalty in exile. He is a divine figure and a legitimate political claimant rolled into one. The suffering he has endured, his wanderings, his persecution, it all fits perfectly into the Peter II narrative. And the fiery baptism that wasn't just a path to salvation. It was the ultimate disguise, a way for the Tsar to hide from his enemies, to shed his old identity so completely that no one would recognize him until the appointed time. You can feel the electricity of this idea as it spreads through the Skoptsy community. It elevates their entire belief system. They are no longer just a sect of outcasts seeking personal purity. They are the guardians of a royal secret, the true loyalists in a nation ruled by a usurper. Their secret meetings are now gatherings of a government in exile. Their mission is no longer just to save souls, but to restore the rightful, holy ruler to the Russian throne. A strange and specific proof offered for this claim was Selivanov's physical appearance. He was a Lutheran Finn by birth, and according to his followers, he bore a passing resemblance to the German-born Peter III. In the flickering candlelight of a secret meeting, to a group of people desperate to believe, this faint resemblance became an undeniable fact. They would point to his posture, the shape of his nose, a certain look in his eye, and whisper, "It is him. It is the Father Tsar." Of course, this claim is one of the most hotly contested parts of the Skoptsy story among historians. Did Selivanov himself concoct this story, or was it invented by his followers? A legend that grew around him that he found useful and decided to embrace. Some scholars believed Selivanov was a cunning strategist who deliberately hijacked the Peter II myth to give his movement mainstream appeal and a powerful political dimension. They argue he saw how effective Pugachev had been in rallying support with the same claim and decided to co-opt it for his own purposes. Other historians argue that Selivanov might have been a genuine mystic, perhaps even delusional, who came to believe the story himself, maybe after years of being called a Christ by his followers. The leap to believing he was also a Tsar wasn't so great. The truth of his personal belief remains a tantalizing mystery. What is certain is that this new doctrine supercharged the movement. It gave them a millennial, apocalyptic edge. Selivanov was no longer just a teacher, he was the prophesied Redeemer. And his return to power would usher in a new age of justice and purity. The Skoptsy now had a political destiny. They began to see their growing wealth not just as a tool for religious expansion, but as a war chest, to be used when the day of revelation finally came. The ship was no longer just an ark to survive the flood, it was a battleship, preparing for a holy war. And its target was the Winter Palace itself. The claim is out there. A dangerous and intoxicating whisper. The truth is a Skoptsy. With this, the stakes have been raised exponentially. You move through the opulent streets of St. Petersburg, the imperial capital, a city of grand neoclassical policies and stunning canals, built by Peter the Great as Russia's window to Europe. But beneath the polished facade of enlightenment and order, the shadow of the Skoptsy is beginning to fall, and it's reaching into the most unexpected and powerful places. The rumors start to fly. At first, they are just whispers at society balls. Gossip exchanged between minor officials over glasses of vodka. Have you heard about the strange sect of financiers who hold secret meetings? They say some of them are in the ministries. They say a certain guard, captain in the Preobrazhensky regiment, never seems to agent has a strange, high-pitched voice. These are the first signs that the Skoptsy's influence, buoyed by their immense wealth and discipline network, is seeping upwards from the merchant and peasant classes into the very machinery of the state. You follow a wealthy Skoptsy money changer as he makes his rounds. He's not just lending to other merchants anymore. You see him slip discreetly into a side entrance of a government ministry. He's meeting with a bureaucrat, a man with a gambling problem and a salary that doesn't match his lifestyle. The Skoptsy doesn't preach to him. He doesn't mention Selivanov or the fiery baptism. He simply offers a solution to the man's financial woes: a generous, low-interest loan. No difficult questions asked. An investment is made. A relationship is formed. No, the Skoptsy have a friend inside the bureaucracy. Someone who might be able to make a troublesome legal document disappear, or provide a warning if an investigation is being planned. This was their strategy: influence through indebtedness. They weaponized their capital. They didn't need to convert the powerful, they just needed to control them. They became the silent partners with the secret creditors to a growing network of people in positions of authority. A police chief here, a customs official there. Even, it was rumored, courtiers within the Winter Palace itself. One of the most persistent and wild rumors of the time. A piece of historical gossip that still fascinates historians. Concerned the Tsar himself, Tsar Alexander I, who reigned in the early 19th century. Alexander was a complex and deeply mystical man, a ruler who was drawn to all sorts of esoteric and religious ideas. He was known to have meetings with mystics, prophets, and spiritual leaders of all stripes. The rumor mill went into overdrive. They said that the Tsar had granted a secret audience to Kondraty Selivanov. This story, likely a fabrication by the Skoptsy themselves to enhance their prestige, was that Alexander, intrigued by the tales of the holy man, had him brought to the palace. Selivanov, standing before the Tsar, did not bow, but instead offered Alexander a choice: accept the fiery baptism himself and become the true white Tsar, or hand over the throne to him, the returned Peter III. This meeting almost certainly never happened. But the very fact that such a rumor could exist and be believable to some shows the incredible level of myth-making and audacity the Skoptsy had achieved. They were writing themselves into the national drama at the highest level. The academic debate here is not about whether these high-level meetings happened, but about the actual extent of Skoptsy influence. How deep did the rabbit hole really go? Some historians take a more skeptical view, arguing that the Skoptsy's power was greatly exaggerated, both by their own bragging and by the fearful gossip of outsiders. They argue that their influence was likely confined to low and mid-level officials, and that they never truly penetrated the inner sanctum of power. Other historians, however, point to the vast fortunes the Skoptsy controlled in the documented cases of corruption among officials, suggesting that their influence was very real and significant. They argue that while they may not have had a man on the inside of the Tsar's immediate circle, they had created a soft network of influence that made them effectively untouchable for a time. You find yourself outside her lavish St. Petersburg mansion. A high-ranking nobleman is hosting a party. Inside, you can hear music and laughter, but you watch as a carriage pulls up to a side gate, and a man in simple, dark clothes is ushered into the house through the servant's entrance. He is a Skoptsy leader. He is not here to party. He is here to meet with the nobleman in his private study, perhaps to discuss a loan, to call in a favor, or to deliver a prophecy. The shadows are indeed creeping into the Kremlin, or at least into the palaces that surround it. The line between a persecuted religious sect and a powerful political conspiracy is becoming dangerously blurred. The ship is no longer just sailing, it's maneuvering for position in the treacherous waters of the Russian court. Let's slip away from the cold, calculated world of finance and politics and back into the spiritual heart of the movement. You've been invited to the most sacred and secret of Skoptsy rituals. It's deep in the night, in a large, windowless room in the basement of Skoptsy owned house. The doors are barred. Lookouts are posted. What happens here is for believers only. You are about to witness a rite in i.e. You've seen a version of this before, with the Khlysty, but the Skoptsy, while borrowing the name in the basic form, have adapted the ritual to fit their own unique theology. The room is starkly empty, but spotlessly clean. The members are all dressed in simple white tunics or shifts, a uniform of purity. Men and women are present, but they stand apart, forming two segregated circles. The air is still unexpectant. The ritual begins not with a wild frenzy, but with a low, mournful chant. The melodies are hypnotic, repeating simple phrases about the sinfulness of the flesh and the beauty of the spirit. They sing of the white dove, a symbol for both Christ and their perfected selves. The sound swells, filling the room. A collective sigh of longing for a world beyond this one. The leader, the ship's helmsman, stands in the center, guiding the chant, his voice a steady anchor in the swirling sea of sound. Then, the movement starts. It's a slow, shuffling circle dance. They hold their arms out, cones up, as if to receive a blessing from above. Round and round they go, a slow, deliberate procession of white-robed figures. The dance is not about individual ecstasy, as it was with the Khlysty. It is about communal unity, about losing your individual identity and merging into the collective body of the ship. The shuffling gets faster, the chanting gets louder, the room gets hotter. This is when the prophecies begin. A woman's voice cuts through the chanting. She stands still, her eyes closed, and speaks in a strange, high-pitched, rhythmic monotone. She is believed to be a vessel for the Holy Spirit. She doesn't predict the price of grain, she speaks of cosmic things. She speaks of the imminent return of their Father Savior, Selivanov's Peter III. She describes a great white city he will build, where only the doves will live. She warns of a coming apocalypse, a fiery judgment that will consume the lecherous world of the outsiders. Her words are a potent mix of hope and terror, reinforcing the group's sense of elite separateness. As the energy in the room reaches its peak, the central part of the Skoptsy rite in IE unfolds. Unlike the Khlysty, who used whips on themselves, the Skoptsy's climax was often one of joyous, non-violent spinning. Individual members, feeling the spirit move them, will move to the center of the room and begin to twirl. Faster and faster they spin, their white robes flaring out, turning them into blurred, angelic figures. They are called God spinners. The goal is to achieve a state of dizziness and disorientation so profound that the conscious mind shuts down, allowing the spirit to soar free. They spin until they collapse from sheer exhaustion, falling into the waiting arms of their brethren, who lay them gently on the floor. One of the most peculiar and little discussed elements of the rite in IE was the concept of spiritual grace being physically transferable. When one of the spinners collapsed, it was believed they were overflowing with divine energy. Other members would rush to them, not just to help, but to touch them, to lay hands on them, hoping to absorb some of that sacred charge. A handkerchief that had wiped the brow of a collapsed prophetess could be kept as a holy relic, believed to possess healing powers. But here is where a great historical controversy lies. The enemies of the Skoptsy, including the official Orthodox Church and the state, accused them of something very different happening at these secret meetings. They claimed that the raid Naya were not chaste affairs at all, but devolved into wild, promiscuous orgies. This was a common accusation leveled against almost any heretical group throughout history, a standard tool in the propagandist's kit. The idea of the Sabbath, the witches' orgy, was a powerful and persistent smear. So, what is the truth? The vast majority of modern historians believe the accusations of orgies were baseless slander. The entire theological foundation of the Sceptsy was a radical, obsessive rejection of sexuality. The idea that they would engage in the very act they had sacrificed so much to eliminate seems logically incoherent. Their own writings and hymns are filled with the genuine horror of the flesh. However, the debate isn't entirely closed. A few scholars have cautiously suggested that in some, perhaps early or breakaway ships, a kind of radical anti-monism might have taken hold, the belief that once you are sealed, you are beyond sin, and therefore no physical act can stain your pure soul. In such a context, it is theoretically possible that some form of ritualized sexual contact could have been reinterpreted as a non-sinful act, but it must be stressed, there is almost no reliable evidence for this. The overwhelming consensus is that the Sceptsy were exactly what they claimed to be: obsessively, fanatically chaste. You watch as the last spinner falls, and a profound quiet descends upon the room. The members are drained, but their faces are luminous with a kind of post-ecstatic peace. They have, for a few hours, danced their way out of their mutilated bodies and into the presence of their God. They have reaffirmed their collective faith and their shared, secret identity. The ride is over, its energy replenishing the spiritual batteries of the ship, preparing them for another week of work, secrecy, and waiting for the end of the world. The prophecies spoken in the heat of the ride were not just abstract spiritual poetry, they coalesced over time into a concrete, collective ambition, a grand project that represented the ultimate culmination of all their efforts. You are now privy to this dream. It is the Skoptsy equivalent of the New Jerusalem, the shining city on a hill. They spoke of it in hushed, reverent tones. It was their endgame, the dream of the white city, or the city of doves. The vision was this: one day, when their Redeemer's Selivanov finally revealed himself and took his rightful place on the throne of Russia, he would use his power to gather all the white doves from their scattered ships across the empire. He would lead them to a chosen spot, a holy piece of land, and there they would build a new capital city. The city would be exclusively for the Skoptsy. No worldly people, no Mirsky, would be allowed to live there. It would be a perfect, self-contained society of the pure. The descriptions of this city in their hymns and prophecies are utopian and fantastical. The walls would be made of white stone, symbolizing the purity of the inhabitants. The streets would be spotlessly clean. There would be no taverns, no brothels, no prisons, because in a city with no sin, these things would be obsolete. The city would be organized as one single, massive ship, with every citizen working for the common good in perfect harmony. It would be a living, breathing monastery, but one that was also the administrative and spiritual center of the entire Russian Empire, and eventually, the world. This wasn't just an idle fantasy, it was a powerful motivator. The wealth they were accumulating was not just for loans and bribes. It was their construction fund. Every kopeck save, every profitable business deal, was another brick for the walls of their future home. This grown, collective goal gave a powerful, tangible purpose to their daily toil and their immense sacrifices. They weren't just saving their own souls, they were building a literal heaven on earth. This dream of a separate, holy city taps into a deep, recurring theme in Russian history and folklore, the legend of the invisible city of Khlysty. According to this beautiful old legend, when the Mongol hordes were sweeping across Russia, the city of Khlysty was saved by a miracle. Rather than be conquered and defiled, the entire city, with all its churches and people, sank beneath the waters of a lake, where it remains, perfectly preserved and invisible to the impure. It is said that only the truly righteous can sometimes hear the bells of Khlysty cathedrals ringing from beneath the water. The Skoptsy dream of a white city is a new version of this myth. They weren't waiting for their city to become invisible, they were planning to build a visible one that would make the glory of God manifest for all to see. A strange, small detail within this grand vision was the idea of a final gathering of the relics. As you know, the Skoptsy treated the removed body parts as sacred objects. Part of the dream of the White City was that a great cathedral would be built at its center. In the foundations of this cathedral, they would inter all the collected relics from every fiery baptism that had ever been performed. It was to be a monument built, quite literally, upon the sum of their collective sacrifices. The historical debate around this utopian plan is not about whether they had it, but about how seriously they pursued it in practical terms. Is there any evidence that they were actually scouting locations or drawing up architectural plans? Some historians believe the White City was always meant to be more of a spiritual metaphor than a literal construction project. They see it as a symbolic representation of the perfected community, a motivational tool rather than a blueprint. They argue it was an eschatological dream, something that would only happen after a divine, world-altering event, not something you hire contractors for. However, other scholars argue that at least some Skoptsy leaders took the plan very literally. They point to the Skoptsy's known obsession with business and practical organization. This was not a group of idle dreamers. They were doers. There are some tantalizing but unconfirmed reports from the 19th century that certain Skoptsy ships in Siberia are vast, sparsely populated land perfect for such a project were beginning to buy up huge, contiguous tracts of land. Were they just investing in timber and farmland? Or were they secretly assembling the real estate for their holy city? The evidence is inconclusive. But it's a fascinating thought. It suggests that while most members were dreaming of the city's white walls, a few pragmatic leaders might have been quietly checking the zoning laws. You stand with a group of Skoptsy on a hill overlooking their village, the sun is setting. In the distance, the domes of Moscow glitter, but they are not looking at Moscow, they are looking past it, to a future only they can see. Their eyes are filled with a vision of a different city, a city of impossible purity, a city built of faith, finance, and flesh. It is a beautiful, terrifying dream, and for a time, with their wealth and influence growing, it must have felt tantalizingly within their reach. But the old world, the world of Tsars and patriarchs, was beginning to take notice, and it was not pleased. The dream of the White City was a beautiful, internal vision. The reality of the Russian state was an external, looming threat. For decades, the Skoptsy had operated with remarkable success in the shadows, their ships sailing undetected through the currents of society. But a movement this large, this wealthy, and this strange could not stay secret forever. The whispers eventually reached the ears of people who could not be bought or intimidated. The empire was about to strike back. The first major blow came during the reign of Catherine the Great, the very empress whose husband Selivanov was supposed to be. You find yourself in a stuffy courtroom in the year 1772. The air is tense. On trial is a group of peasants from the Urwal province, accused of unnatural and heretical practices. Standing among them is their leader, a man with piercing eyes and a quiet, defiant demeanor, Kondraty Selivanov. He and his early followers had been discovered. A local priest, alarmed by the number of his male parishioners who were suddenly unfit for marriage and were refusing to attend confession, began an investigation. He uncovered the secret meetings, heard whispers of the fiery baptism, and immediately reported it to the authorities. For the Russian state and the Orthodox Church, which were essentially two arms of the same body, this was not just a minor heresy, it was a direct attack on the foundations of society. Think about it from the state's perspective. The Skoptsy's doctrine was a demographic nightmare. The empire's strength was built on a growing population of peasants who could serve as soldiers and taxpayers. A group that preached the complete cessation of procreation was, in a very real sense, committing treason against the future of Russia. Their rejection of marriage undermined the Church's most sacred sacrament. The secret. Wealthy communes operated outside of state control and taxation. They were a cancer, and the state's response was to try and cut it out. The trial is a show of force. The prosecutors portray Selivanov not as a spiritual leader, but as a monstrous charlatan, a madman who preys on the ignorant and leads them to self-destruction. The Skoptsy on trial remains silent or speak in riddles, refusing to confess or implicate others. But the verdict is a foregone conclusion. Selivanov is found guilty. The sentence is not execution. The state was often wary of creating martyrs, but something they hoped would be a living death. He is sentenced to be brutally flogged with the cane out, a terrible whip designed to tear flesh from bone, and then exiled for life to the remote, frozen wasteland of Siberia. This is meant to be the end of the story. The leader is removed. The flock will scatter, but the state fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the movement they were dealing with. For the Skoptsy, this wasn't a defeat, it was a fulfillment of prophecy. They believed that a true prophet must suffer persecution, just as Christ had suffered. The trial, the flogging, the exile, it was all proof of Selivanov's holiness. It authenticated his struggle. They didn't see him as a convicted criminal, they saw him as their Redeemer's ark, beginning his long passion. A strange and obscure detail of this first persecution is how the Skoptsy immediately turned it into a part of their mythology. They began to refer to the investigators and judges as the modern-day Pharisees and Pilate's servants. They composed secret hymns about Selivanov's trial, portraying him as a silent, dignified figure standing against the screaming mob, just like in the Gospels. They had an incredible gift for spinning every worldly defeat into a spiritual victory. The historical debate here concerns the effectiveness of this early crackdown. Did it actually hurt the movement in the short term? Yes. The ship in or YOL was broken up, and other communities were forced to go deeper underground, but many historians argue that in the long term, the persecution was actually a gift to the Skoptsy. It solidified their identity as a persecuted holy remnant, which made their message even more appealing to the disaffected and rebellious. It also forced them to perfect their methods of secrecy and decentralization, making them even harder to eradicate in the future. The state, by trying to stamp out the fire, had inadvertently fanned the flames and scattered the embers across the empire. As you watch Selivanov, his back raw and bloody from the KNO, being loaded onto a prisoner cart for the long, agonizing journey east, you don't see a broken man. You see the beginning of a legend. His physical absence would make him an even more powerful figure. He would become a martyr, a myth, a spiritual father ruling his kingdom from the icy wilderness of his exile. The state thought they were cutting off the head of the serpent, but they had just turned it into a hydra. For every ship they smashed, two more would quietly be built in its place. The first round was over. The empire had won the battle, but the war for Russia's soul was just beginning. The prisoner cart rattles and sways, its iron-rimmed wheels groaning over the frozen ruts of the Siberian track T, the great road leading into exile. You travel alongside it, a phantom witness to one of history's most brutal punishments. This is Siberia. It's not just a place, it's a concept. A vast, empty prison, walled by ice and distance, for centuries. This is where the Russian state sent its problems to be forgotten criminals, political dissidents, and now, religious heretics. You are following Kondraty Selivanov and his condemned followers into the white wilderness. The journey itself is a trial. It takes months, sometimes years. The prisoners march in chains, trudging through ankle-deep mud in the spring, choking on dust in the summer, and battling frostbite in the soul-crushing cold of the winter. They are fed scraps, housed in squalid transit prisons, and treated with contempt by their guards. Many die along the way from disease, exhaustion, or malnutrition, but for the Skoptsy, this brutal trek becomes a kind of pilgrimage. It is their version of the Stations of the Cross. Every step is a prayer. Every lash from a guard's whip is a shared suffering with their prophet. They finally arrive at their destination, a remote, hard labor settlement near the city of Irkutsk, thousands of miles from Moscow. Here, life is stripped down to its barest essentials. The world is reduced to the punishing rhythm of the work-day, felling timber in the endless taiga, working in a state-owned mine, or processing salt. The landscape is monotonous and overwhelming, a seemingly infinite expanse of snow and trees that can break a person's spirit. This is where the state expected the Skoptsy faith to wither and die. Separated from their communities, deprived of their wealth, and subjected to brutal labor, their strange beliefs should have evaporated like breath in the frigid air. But the opposite happens. Siberia, intended as a prism, becomes a crucible. It burns away the half-hearted and forges the true believers into something harder than steel. In the barracks at night, huddled together for warmth, the Skoptsy faith becomes their only solace. They can't hold a proper ride in IE, but they can whisper their hymns. They can't perform the seals, but they can preach their doctrine to other prisoners. Selivanov, even while performing hard labor, continues to be their spiritual leader. His endurance, his unwavering faith in the face of immense suffering, only enhances his mystique. He becomes a living saint among the damned. His presence a source of hope in a hopeless place. A fascinating and little-known aspect of this period is that the Skoptsy exiles actually became highly valued prisoners. Think about it. In a penal colony rife with alcoholism, death, and violence, the Skoptsy were a warden's dream. They were sober, disciplined, and incredibly hard-working. They never caused fights. They simply did their work with a quiet, unnerving diligence, believing that their labor was a form of worship. As a result, they were often given positions of trust within the prison camp system as clerks, cooks, or shoremen. This gave them a small measure of power and the ability to help their fellow believers, ensuring they got slightly better food or less strenuous work assignments. The Siberian exile also became an accidental missionary enterprise. The Skoptsy were imprisoned alongside a whole spectrum of Russian society: disgraced nobles, rebellious peasants, common criminals, and members of other banned religious sects. In this captive audience, the Skoptsy found fertile ground for new converts. Their message of a sacred truth, of suffering as a sign of holiness, and of a community that takes care of its own, resonated deeply with their fellow outcasts. The state had intended to isolate the infection, but instead, they had placed it in a petri dish filled with Russia's most vulnerable and disaffected souls. There is a historical debate over the nature of Selivanov's own experience during this time. The official Skoptsy narrative, of course, paints him as a Christ-like figure, enduring his suffering with divine grace. But some historical records present a more complex picture. There are hints that he engaged in a long, subtle battle of wits with his captors. Was he truly a passive sufferer? Or was he an active, cunning leader, using his status as a model prisoner to manipulate the system? From within, some accounts suggest he was able to maintain a secret correspondence with his followers back in European Russia, sending out letters of prophecy and instruction. If true, it means that even from the depths of Siberia, from a place designed to silence him forever, Kondraty Selivanov was still running his shadow empire. You stand on the edge of a vast, frozen river. The sun is a weak, white disk in a grey sky. You see Selivanov, now an old man, his face a roadmap of hardship, his body bent from years of labor. He looks out at the endless expanse of white. The state sees a broken prisoner in a desolate wasteland. But he sees something else. He sees a training ground. He sees a recruiting office. And he sees a patient, growing army of the faithful, being tempered in the fires of exile, waiting for the day their king would be called home. The exile was not the end. It was merely a strategic retreat. History is a pendulum. It swings from repression to tolerance and back again. The long, brutal winter of the Siberian exile is about to give way to a sudden, improbable spring. You travel forward in time, leaving the reign of the pragmatic Catherine the Great and her hard-nosed son Paul I behind. You arrive in the year 1801, at the dawn of the reign of a new Tsar Alexander I, and with his ascension to the throne, everything changes for the Skoptsy. Alexander I was a fascinating, contradictory figure. He was known as the Blessed, the man who defeated Napoleon, but he was also a deeply troubled soul, drawn to mysticism, spiritualism, and all forms of non-traditional faith. His court was a bizarre cocktail of Orthodox tradition, European enlightenment, and occultish fervor. For a time, the official policy of religious persecution was relaxed, replaced by an atmosphere of curious, if cautious, tolerance. This was the window of opportunity the Skoptsy had been waiting for. Word of the holy sufferers in Siberia reaches the drawing rooms of St. Petersburg. Influential mystics and well-meaning nobles, caught up in the new spirit of the age, begin to petition the Tsar on behalf of the strange sect. They portray the Skoptsy not as dangerous heretics, but as simple, pious folk who had been unjustly persecuted for their sincere, if eccentric, beliefs. They speak of Kondraty Selivanov not as a rebel, but as a wise old holy man, a star ETS, whose wisdom Russia needed. In a stunning reversal of fortune, Tsar Alexander, likely influenced by his own mystical inclinations, agrees. In 1802, after nearly 30 years of exile, Kondraty Selivanov is pardoned and recalled from Siberia. You watch as the old man, now frail and stooped, makes the long journey back to European Russia. But he is no longer a prisoner in chains. He arrives in St. Petersburg as a minor celebrity, a living legend, a martyr returned from the dead. This is the beginning of the Skoptsy's golden age. Selivanov is not allowed complete freedom, but he is given a comfortable form of house arrest in a charitable institution called the Hospice for Incurable S. This, ironically, becomes his royal court. From this home, he holds sway over his rapidly growing flock. The Skoptsy, now feeling the warmth of official tolerance, emerge from the shadows. Their money, once hidden, is now used to buy lavish properties. They establish a magnificent ship in St. Petersburg, centered around a mansion that becomes known as the New Jerusalem. You find yourself inside this mansion. The scale of the wealth is breathtaking. The walls are covered in silk, and the icons in the corner are adorned with gold and precious stones. This is not the humble peasant hut where the faith was born. This is the headquarters of a rich and powerful corporation, and at its center, treated with a reverence bordering on deification, sits Selivanov. He is now known among his followers as the Skoptil, the Redeemer. A strange and specific feature of this period was the pilgrimage to see Selivanov. Skoptsy from all over the empire would make the long journey to St. Petersburg, just for a chance to be in his presence. But more surprisingly, he also began to attract visitors from the worldly elite, high society ladies, curious nobles, and foreign revelers, fascinated by the tales of the Cow Street Prophet, would come to his residence to receive his blessing or hear his cryptic wisdom. He had become one of the city's star attractions. This open embrace by the upper classes leads to a historical debate. Was this a genuine period of tolerance? Or was the state simply trying a new strategy of co-optation? Some historians argue that Alexander and his government genuinely believed they could domesticate the Skoptsy. By allowing them a degree of freedom and status, they hoped to moderate their extremist views and integrate their economic power into the state. It was a keep your enemies closer approach. Other historians contend that the government was simply naive, underestimating the Skoptsy's unwavering fanaticism and their deep-seated opposition to the state. They argue that the Skoptsy leaders were masters of public relations, presenting a soft, pious public face of a wise old holy man, while secretly continuing their radical recruitment and rituals behind closed doors. Selivanov himself plays the part perfectly. To his high society visitors, he is a gentle, humble sage. To his followers, in secret, Here's the Redeemer Tsar, biding his time, waiting for the signal from God to claim his throne. The movement swells in numbers and wealth. They are at the absolute zenith of their power and influence. They operate with a semi-official impunity, their ships openly recruiting, their treasuries overflowing, their leaders rubbing shoulders with the powerful. For a fleeting, brilliant moment, it must have seemed like their prophecies were coming true. The dream of the White City felt closer than ever. But pendulums, by their very nature, always swing back. And the higher they swing in one direction, the more violent the return journey will be. The Golden Age is in full swing. The Skoptsy are moving with a newfound confidence. Their ships operating more openly than ever before. But how do you function as a secret society when you're suddenly basking in the public? How does a believer from a ship in Odessa recognize a brother from a ship in Arkhangel when they meet by chance in a crowded Moscow market during this period of expansion? The Skoptsy perfected a subtle and fascinating system of secret communication or language of signs, symbols, uncoded speech. You are back in the bustling marketplace. But now, you know what to look for. You watch as two men, seemingly strangers, approach each other. One is buying a bolt of cloth from the other. As the buyer receives his change, he performs a small, seemingly natural gesture. He takes the coins and, in a fluid motion, grips them in a specific way, his thumb pressed against his forefinger, while his other three fingers are extended. It looks like a simple, unconscious gesture, but it's not. It's a sign. The seller responds by scratching his own chin with a similar, three-fingered gesture. The recognition is complete. A silent conversation has taken place. Are you one of us? Yes. I am. This was the first layer of their secret language, a simple, portable set of hand gestures. These signs were easy to learn and could be disguised as everyday fidgets or mannerisms. They allowed Skoptsy to identify each other in public without arousing any suspicion. It was a vital tool for a decentralized network, allowing travelers, missionaries, and merchants to instantly connect with the local ship in any new town they entered. But the communication went deeper than just hand signals. They developed a whole lexicon of coded speech, a jargon that allowed them to discuss their most secret doctrines in public. They would never use the word castration. Instead, they would speak of purification, or receiving the seal, or more poetically, of riding the white horse. A new convert who had just undergone the lesser seal might be described as having had his lamb weighed. Someone aspiring to the greater seal was said to be seeking the full measure of cleanliness. Their prophecies and key figures were also given code names. Kondraty Selivanov was often referred to simply as the father or the grandfather. Sometimes, in a nod to the Peter III myth, he was called the one who is coming. The state, the enemy, was Babylon. The official Orthodox Church was the horror of Babylon's mother. Their secret gatherings, the Ride and Near, were called councils or simply meetings. This allowed them to make plans and exchange information in letters or even in conversation, in a way that would be completely meaningless to an outsider who might overhear them. One of the most peculiar and symbolic of their secret signs was the white dove itself. This wasn't just a metaphor, it became a visual emblem. Some Skoptsy would have small, discrete images of a dove embroidered on their clothes, or carved into a personal item like a wooden spoon or a walking stick. A particularly bizarre, and probably apocryphal, story tells of a secret handshake that mimicked the fluttering of a dove's wings. While likely an invention of their enemies, it speaks to how central this image was to their identity. The dove symbolized everything they aspired to be: pure, white, and capable of flying free from the filth of the earth. The academic debate here focuses on the origin of these symbols. Were they created systematically by the leadership and disseminated through the network, or did they develop organically, like slang, with different signs and phrases emerging in different regions and then gradually becoming standardized? The evidence suggests a mix of both. The core theological code words, like the seal, were likely part of the original teachings. but the vast array of hand gestures and local jargon probably evolved from the ground up, a product of the believers' own creativity and their constant need for security. It was a living language of secrecy, constantly adapting to new circumstances. This secret language also served a powerful psychological purpose. It reinforced the boundary between us and them. To know the signs, to speak the jargon, was to be an insider, part of an exclusive, enlightened group. It made the world feel like a stage on which they were the only ones who understood the true script. It fostered a powerful sense of belonging and superiority, which helped to insulate them from the scorn and judgment of the outside world. You watch the two men in the market part ways. One gives a slight nod. The other touches his hat. To the world, it was a simple transaction, but you saw the flicker of recognition, the silent confirmation of a shared, world-altering secret. It was a reminder that even at the height of their golden age, the Skoptsy never forgot who they were: a clandestine army, a state within a state, communicating in a language of shadows, waiting for the command to step into the light. The pendulum swings back. The era of mystical tolerance under Alexander I comes to a decisive, brutal end. In 1825, a new Tsar ascends the throne of Russia. His name is Nicholas I, and his nickname in history tells you everything you need to know the Iron Tsar. He was the polar opposite of his predecessor, a rigid, militaristic autocrat who despised disorder, mysticism, and anything that deviated from his strict vision of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. For the Skoptsy, the party was over. A deep, chilling frost was about to descend. You are there on the day Nicholas takes power. His reign begins with the suppression of the Decembrist revolt, a badly organized coup by a group of liberal-minded army officers. Nicholas crushes the rebellion with ruthless efficiency. The event sets the tone for his entire 30-year rule. He sees secret societies and unconventional ideas not as harmless eccentricities, but as existential threats to the stability of his empire. And the Skoptsy, with their secret meetings, their vast wealth, their charismatic leader claiming to be a former Tsar, and their doctrine that literally attacked the demographic future of Russia, were at the very top of his hit list. The change in atmosphere is immediate and terrifying. The high society patrons who once flocked to see Selivanov now shun him. The government officials who were once friendly or indebted to the Skoptsy now turn on them, eager to prove their loyalty to the new regime. The period of quiet impunity is shattered. The Iron Tsar unleashes the full power of the state security apparatus, his infamous third section, the secret police, against the sect. The first target is the head, Kondraty Selivanov, now a very old man. He is removed from his comfortable house arrest. He is declared a threat to the state and imprisoned in the monastery fortress of Suzdal, one of the most notorious religious prisons in Russia. This time, there is no ambiguity. He is not a guest, he is a prisoner of the state, confined to a solitary cell, cut off from all contact with his followers. He is to be silenced permanently. Then, the crackdown begins in earnest across the empire. It is systematic and relentless. You witness raids on Skoptsy ships in Moscow, Street, and the provincial towns. The secret police, acting on information from a new network of spies and informants, burst into homes and businesses. They confiscate the account books of the treasurers, seizing the vast fortunes that had been accumulated over decades. This was a key part of Nicholas's strategy, not just to punish the believers, but to destroy their economic base, to bleed them dry financially. Mass arrests follow, hundreds, then thousands of Skoptsy are rounded up. The trials are swift and the sentences harsh. The rank-and-file members are often sentenced to internal exile, not to the relative anonymity of a large Siberian labor camp as before, but to forced settlement in the most remote, inhospitable regions imaginable, like the Caucasus or the Yakutsk region of Siberia, where they were to be scattered in small groups to prevent them from forming new communities. The leaders, the helmsmen and treasurers, were often sentenced to hard labor in military fortresses, a punishment designed to break both body and spirit. A particularly cruel and little-known tactic used during this period was the re-education of Skoptsy children. If a Skoptsy household was discovered, any children living there, usually adopted or from a family that had converted, were forcibly removed by the state. They were placed in military orphanages or given to Orthodox families to be raised, their minds and bodies to be cured of the heretical taint. It was a form of cultural warfare, designed to cut the movement off from any future generation. The historical debate surrounding this period focuses on its effectiveness. Did Nicholas I succeed in destroying the Skoptsy on the surface? It was a devastating blow. The leadership was imprisoned, the wealth was confiscated, and the communities were shattered and scattered. Many historians argue that the Iron Tsar's persecution was the mortal wound from which the movement never truly recovered. They contend that while Skoptsy communities survived, they were never again the powerful, wealthy, and politically ambitious force they had been during their golden age. The movement was driven so deep underground that it lost its coherence and momentum. However, a counter-argument exists. Other scholars suggest that the Skoptsy's decentralized, cellular structure, the very thing that had helped them survive the first persecution, allowed them to endure this one as well. They argue that Nicholas's iron fist, while brutal, could not be everywhere at once. In the vastness of the Russian Empire, many ships simply disconnected from the central network and went into a state of deep hibernation, waiting for the storm to pass. They became quieter, smaller, and more paranoid, but they did not disappear. They survived, preserving the core of their faith in isolated pockets, like seeds buried under a layer of frozen earth. You watch as a group of Skoptsy, chained together, are marched onto a barge that will take them to some distant, frozen corner of the empire. Their faces are grim, but not broken. You see in their eyes the familiar, stubborn glint of the true believer. Persecution, to them, was not a sign of failure. It was the expected state of affairs. The world was Babylon, and Babylon was supposed to be cruel. The Golden Age had been an anomaly. This felt more normal. This was the price of being chosen. The Iron Tsar had declared war, but the White Doves, though scattered and wounded, were not yet ready to surrender. The Iron Tsar's grip is tight. The great ships have been broken apart, their treasures seized, their crews scattered. And what of the admiral of this phantom fleet who traveled to the ancient town of Suzdal, a place of so many churches and monasteries that it seems to exist in a different century? Here, within the thick, whitewashed walls of the monastery of St. Eutymius, is one of the state's most secure prisons, and in one of its damp, cold cells, Kondraty Selivanov is spending his final days. The contrast with his life in St. Petersburg is absolute. Gone are the silk cushions, the reverent visitors, the whispered adulation. His world has shrunk to the size of this small stone room. A hard coat, a single icon on the wall, a small, barred window high above his head offering a sliver of grey sky. He is now over 90 years old, a frail relic of a man. His guards are monks, tasked with his spiritual correction, though their primary duty is to ensure he remains isolated from the world. He is a prisoner, but even here, in his final confinement, he remains a figure of immense power. For his followers, he is more potent than ever. He is their sovereign king, their prophet in the wilderness, their redeemer completing his final trial before his ultimate triumph. His imprisonment becomes the central, unifying story for the scattered Skoptsy communities. Every hardship they face is a reflection of the hardship their father is enduring in his holy prison. His silence makes his voice louder, his absence makes his presence more palpable. You watch him in his cell. He spends his days in what appears to be silent prayer. He is calm, serene, seemingly untroubled by his fate. He has become the living embodiment of the ideal he preached, the conquest of the self, the utter detachment from the physical world. Or has he the monks who guard him report that he is a model prisoner, quiet and obedient, but they also report a strange, unnerving intensity about him, a sense that even in his frailty, he is possessed of an unshakable certainty. A little known but poignant detail from this time concerns the attempts by his followers to reach him. Despite the tight security, brave Skoptsy missionaries would travel to Suzdal. Disguised as simple pilgrims, they couldn't see him, but they would pray outside the monastery walls, hoping to send their spiritual strength to their leader. There are tales of secret messages passed through sympathetic guards, of prophecies allegedly written by Selivanov on scraps of paper and smuggled out of the prison. Most of these are likely fabrications, pious forgeries created to keep hope alive, but they show the desperate need of the flock to remain connected to their shepherd. The final years of a charismatic leader often lead to a historical debate, the question of succession. As Selivanov wasted away, was there a struggle for power within the Skoptsy movement? Did different factions emerge, each claiming to be his true heir? The historical record is murky on this point, largely because the movement was so fragmented by the persecution. It seems there was no single, designated successor. Instead, the authority of Selivanov became a kind of disembodied crown that various powerful helmsmen of the surviving ships would implicitly claim to wear. They would issue prophecies in the spirit of the father, effectively channeling his authority to lead their own local communities. Selivanov's legacy was too large for one person to inherit. Instead, it was divided among his most powerful disciples. In the year 1832, after more than a decade in the Suzdal prison, Kondraty Selivanov dies. The official cause is simply old age. He is said to have passed away peacefully in his sleep. The authorities bury him in an unmarked grave in the monastery grounds, hoping to prevent it from becoming a shrine. It's a quiet, ignominious end for a man who claimed to be a czar and a god. But for the Skoptsy, this is not the end, it is the ascension. The news of his death spreads through the underground network, not as a tragedy, but as a triumph. The Father has shed his final earthly shell. The Redeemer has completed his work. They believe he has not truly died, but has become a pure spirit, a divine presence who can now be with all of them, everywhere, at all times. His death transforms him from a historical figure into a purely theological one. He is no longer a man in a cell who is a god in their hearts. The unmarked grave in Suzdal, despite the authorities' best efforts, does become a secret pilgrimage site for decades to come. Skoptsy would risk arrest to come to the monastery, to press a hand against the cold stone of its walls, to feel close to the place where their founder had completed his earthly journey. The man was gone. The myth was now immortal. The founder's death didn't kill the faith, it made it permanent, embedding it in the realm of belief, where the iron fist of a czar could no longer reach it. The founder is dead. The golden age is a distant memory. The Iron Tsar's persecution continues unabated. What becomes of a body when its head has been severed? You witness the next phase of the Skoptsy story, not a cohesive movement anymore, but a great scattering. This is the beginning of the Bolshevik era as we know it, the Great Dispersion. Imagine the Skoptsy community as a single, solid block of ice. Nicholas's regime is a hammer, smashing it into 1,000 shards. You see this happening in a town on the Volga River. For years, a prosperous Skoptsy ship has operated here, centered around a successful grain merchant's business. Now, the secret police have arrived. The merchant is arrested. His warehouse is seized. The known members of the community are rounded up. Their communal house is shuttered. The ship is sunk. What happens to the crew? They are scattered to the four winds. A few are sent to hard labor, but most are subjected to a policy of forced resettlement. A family is sent to a village in the Caucasus. A small group of men are exiled to a tiny settlement in the Ural Mountains. A few women are sent to a town in the far north. The state's strategy is clear: traumatize the community, break up the critical mass of believers needed to sustain the faith, isolate them in small, manageable pockets where they will be surrounded by loyal Orthodox peasants, in the hope that their strange beliefs will simply dissolve into the mainstream over time. You follow one of these small groups of exiles. They are a half-dozen men, being marched to a new life in a remote corner of Siberia they've never heard of. Their journey is arduous, but their spirit is a strange mixture of resignation and defiance. They have lost everything: their homes, their wealth, their community. But they have not lost their faith in their minds. This is just another chapter in their people's long history of suffering. They are the new Israelites, being led into a new Babylonian captivity. This dispersion had a paradoxical effect. While it shattered the Skoptsy as an organized national movement, it also spread their ideas to the farthest flung corners of the vast Russian Empire. Before, the faith was concentrated in certain regions. Now, you could find a handful of white doves living in a Cossack village on the Don River. A couple of Skoptsy artisans quietly plying their trade in a port on the White Sea. A lone believer working as a clerk in a mining town in the Altai Mountains. They became a hidden diaspora within their own country. A curious and obscure consequence of this scattering was the mutation of the faith. Separated from the central authority of the great ships of St. Petersburg and Moscow, these isolated pockets began to develop their own unique traditions and interpretations. It was like a game of telephone played across a continent. A hymn that was sung one way in Tambov might be sung with a different melody and slightly different words in the Caucasus. A ritual that was performed with solemnity in one place might take on a more ecstatic flavor in another. The faith began to develop regional dialects. Some historians argue this was the beginning of the end, a dilution of the original doctrine. Others see it as a sign of the faith's incredible adaptability, its ability to take root and evolve in different soils. The historical question of this era is one of survival. How did these tiny, isolated groups manage to persist? At all the answer lies in their extreme secrecy and their economic discipline. A scattered Skoptsy family arriving in a new village would be a model of quiet industry. They would work harder than anyone else. They would save their money. They would slowly, carefully, build a small pocket of prosperity, and they would keep their beliefs entirely to themselves. Perhaps for a generation, they would attend the local Orthodox church. They would pay their taxes. They would be perfect citizens on the surface. But in the privacy of their own homes, they would teach their adopted children the secret hymns. They would tell the stories of Selivanov. They would keep the flame of the faith alive, a tiny, hidden ember, waiting for a friendlier wind. This is the great tragedy and the great achievement of the dispersion. The movement lost its power, its ability to challenge the state or to dream of a white city. But it gained a tenacious, weed-like resilience. You could cut it down in one place, but its seeds had already blown 1,000 miles away, ready to sprout in some forgotten corner of the empire. You stand in a dusty, remote village square. You see a man, a newcomer, quietly mending a fishing net. His neighbors know him as a hard worker who keeps to himself. They don't know that every knot he ties is a prayer, that in his mind he is not in Siberia, but on the deck of a great ship, and that he is waiting, with the patience of a saint, for the day the fleet will reassemble. The hammer of the Ironser has scattered the shards of the Skoptsy faith across the vast, inhospitable landscape of the Russian Empire, but some of them, through a combination of luck, cunning, and sheer desperation, managed to slip through the bars of the imperial cage entirely. You now follow a small, determined group of believers on a new kind of journey. They are not being marched east into the Siberian frost, they are fleeing south, towards the border. Their destination a new promised land. Their refuge Romania. Why Romania in the mid-19th century? The regions of Wallachia and Moldavia, which would later form the core of modern Romania, were a chaotic frontier zone, nominally under the suzerainty of the Ottoman Empire, but with a large degree of local autonomy and a complex relationship with their powerful Russian neighbor. For Russian dissidents, it was a perfect grey area. The Ottoman authorities had little interest in enforcing the religious edicts of the Russian Tsar, and the local Romanian boyars nobles were often happy to welcome industrious, disciplined settlers. No questions asked. You are with a family of Skoptsy as they make the perilous border crossing at night, bribing a guard with the last of their hidden silver. They went across the Piut River, leaving the land of the Tsar behind them. The sense of relief is palpable. For the first time in their lives, they are in a place where they are not being actively hunted. They make their way to the Danube Delta, a wild, marshy region of tall reeds and winding waterways. Here, they find what they are looking for: an established community of fellow Russian religious exiles. This wasn't just a Skoptsy phenomenon. For centuries, this region had been a haven for other Russian old believers and sectarians fleeing persecution. The Skoptsy were simply the latest wave to wash up on this shore of relative freedom. In towns like Tsarist and Kondraty, and especially in the city of Bucharest, the Skoptsy don't just survive, they thrive. You find yourself in the Skoptsy quarter of Bucharest. It's a startling sight. Here, they are not hiding. They have built their own prayer house. A large, handsome building known to locals as the Skopterier. It is, in effect, a public ship. They practice their faith openly. On certain days, you can hear their strange, high-pitched hymns drifting out into the street. Freed from the constant threat of the secret police, their legendary economic discipline goes into overdrive. They become famous as the best cab drivers in Bucharest. A Skoptsy cab driver was famously reliable. He was sober. He knew the city. He wouldn't try to cheat you. And his horses were always the best cared for in the city. They became so dominant in this trade that for a time, Skoptsy and cab driver were almost synonymous in the city's slang. They also excelled as money lenders and jewelers, just as they had in Russia. A particularly strange and little-known fact is that this Romanian branch of the Skoptsy became a sort of Vatican in exile for the believers still trapped in Russia. The leaders of the Bucharest community grew incredibly wealthy and influential. They would use their money to fund missionaries to secretly travel back into Russia, to bring news, money, and spiritual guidance to the scattered, hidden communities. They printed Skoptsy religious texts and smuggled them across the border. For a time, Bucharest, not St. Petersburg or Moscow, was the true center of the Skoptsy world. The historical debate here centers on the long-term impact of this Romanian refuge. Did this freedom ultimately preserve the faith or dilute it? Some historians argue that the Romanian communities were the lifeline that allowed the Skoptsy to survive the brutal persecutions of the late 19th and early 20th centuries in Russia. They were the keepers of the flame, the safe harbor where the core doctrines and financial resources of the faith were preserved. However, other scholars suggest that this very freedom led to a slow decline. In Russia, the constant persecution kept the faith pure and radical. It was a high-stakes choice. But in the relative comfort of Bucharest, over generations, the sharp edges began to wear off. The children and grandchildren of the first exiles grew up in a world where being a Skoptsy was more of a cultural identity than a radical spiritual commitment. They might belong to the community for its social and economic benefits. But the fiery, apocalyptic fervor of the founders began to fade. The movement became less of a cult and more of a social club with a very peculiar entry requirement. You watch an old Skoptsy cab driver in Bucharest. He is a respected elder in his community, a man who remembers the stories of the escape from Russia. He looks at the younger generation, who seem more interested in buying new carriages than in debating the finer points of prophecy. He sees the slow, comfortable assimilation that is happening. The Romanian refuge saved the Skoptsy from the Tsar's police, but it exposed them to a more insidious threat: normalcy. The hammer of persecution had failed to destroy them, but the warm embrace of tolerance might just lull them into obsolescence. The 19th century bleeds into the 20th. Tsars come and go. The iron-fisted persecution of Nicholas I gives way to the slightly more chaotic and inconsistent policies of his successors. The Skoptsy, both in their Romanian refuge and in their hidden pockets within Russia, endure. They are a ghost, a stubborn remnant of a wilder spiritual age. But a storm is gathering that will make the repressions of the Tsars look like a summer shower. A new color is about to be painted across the map of Russia. a color that has no place for God, let alone a bizarre cult of self-mutilating bankers. The color is red. You find yourself in the chaos of the Russian Revolution and the ensuing civil war. The old world is being torn down with a shocking violence. The Tsar and his family are executed. The Orthodox Church, once a pillar of the state, is now an enemy of the people. For a brief, confusing moment, some Skoptsy might have felt a glimmer of hope. The new Bolshevik regime was destroying their ancient enemy, the terrorist state and its official church. Perhaps this new world would have a place for them. They were catastrophically wrong. The new Soviet government, built on the rigid ideology of Marxist-Leninism, was officially, aggressively atheist. To the Bolsheviks, all religion was the opiate of the masses, a tool of class oppression that had to be eradicated. They might have despised the Orthodox Church, but they viewed groups like the Skoptsy with an even greater contempt. To them, the Skoptsy were the very essence of the dark, superstitious, pre-modern Russia they were determined to drag, kicking and screaming, into the industrial 20th century. The Soviet state brought a new level of efficiency and ruthlessness to the task of repression. The Tsar's secret police, the OKH-RANA, were brutal amateurs compared to the Cheka, the forerunner of the KGB. The Soviets didn't just want to scatter the Skoptsy, they wanted to annihilate them as a concept. You witnessed the final act of this long drama in a small, forgotten village in the North Caucasus, one of the last places where a significant, cohesive Skoptsy community had managed to survive. In the 1920s and 30s, during Stalin's collectivization campaign, the state's apparatus rolls into the village. The Skoptsy, with their private businesses, their communal wealth, and their rejection of the worldly Soviet collective farm, were branded as Kulak's wealthy peasant exploiters and class enemies. Their prayer house is not just closed, it is dynamited. Their icons and religious texts are not just confiscated, they are piled in the street and burned in a great bonfire. The leaders of the community are arrested, given summary trials by a troika, and executed or sent to the rapidly expanding network of gulag camps, from which very few would return. Their wealth, the last remnants of their once great financial empire, is seized for the state. They were subjected to a level of organized, ideological persecution that made the terrorist effort seem almost haphazard. A specific, chilling detail of this final persecution was the use of modern medicine and psychology against them. Soviet doctors and ethnograpers were sent to study the remaining Skoptsy, not with the curiosity of a historian, but with the clinical detachment of a pathologist examining a diseased organ. They were officially classified as a social pathology, their faith diagnosed as a form of mass mental illness, a product of ignorance and terrorist oppression. This medicalized language stripped them of any remaining spiritual dignity. They weren't heretics anymore, they were patients, specimens of a primitive mindset that needed to be cured by the light of Soviet enlightenment. The historical debate here is less of a debate and more of a final postmortem. Did any part of the Skoptsy movement survive the Soviet period? The overwhelming consensus is no. The combination of violent suppression, forced collectivization, official atheism, and the pervasive surveillance of the totalitarian state was simply too much. Unlike the terrorist persecutions, which left cracks for the faith to survive in, the Soviet system was a steamroller. It crushed them completely. While a few isolated believers may have lived out their lives in secret, they were unable to pass the faith on. The chain of transmission, which had survived for a century and a half, was finally broken. The same fate befell the communities in Romania, which were snuffed out after the country fell under Soviet influence following World War II. You stand in the ashes of the burned prayer books. The last generation of white dubs is being marched away to the camps. The children are being sent to state orphanages to be raised as good young pioneers. The story of the Skoptsy as a living, breathing faith is over. The great, strange ship, having navigated the storms of terrorist autocracy for 150 years, has finally run aground on the shores of the 20th century and been broken to pieces by the red tide. The ship is wrecked. The crew is gone. The red tide has receded, leaving behind the wreckage of the 20th century. You are now standing in the present, or something close to it. In a modern, post-Soviet Russia, the physical presence of the Skoptsy has vanished from the earth so completely, it's as if they were a dream. There are no prayer houses, no communities, no one to teach you the secret handshakes. All that's left are echoes. Faint, strange, and lingering in the most unexpected corners of Russian culture. You wander into an academic library in Moscow. Here, in dusty archives, is one of the places the Skoptsy survive. They live on as a subject of intense scholarly fascination. Historians, sociologists, and theologians pore over the old Tsarist police records, the confiscated letters, the memoirs of former members. They are no longer a threat, they are a data set. A fascinating case study in religious extremism, social control, and the surprising intersection of asceticism and capitalism. They have been transformed from believers into a bibliography. But their echo is louder outside the walls of the academy. You find it in Russian literature, the image of the strange, otherworldly castrate. The man who has sacrificed his humanity for a higher purpose became a potent and recurring trope. Great writers were fascinated by them. Dostoevsky, with his profound interest in the extremes of faith and madness, is thought to have been influenced by Skoptsy-like figures in his characters. And Rabelais' symbolist masterpiece, The Silver Dove, is a direct and powerful exploration of the hypnotic, destructive world of a flagellant sect, clearly modelled on the Khlysty and the Skoptsy. They became a kind of literary shorthand for the dark, mystical, and irrational undercurrent of the Russian soul. Then there are the urban legends. You sit in a kitchen in a street, Petersburg apartment block, listening to an old woman, a babushka, share stories. She might tell you a ghost story about a famously wealthy 19th century merchant's house. They say he was one of them, she'll whisper, her eyes wide. That's why he was so rich. He made a pact, and they say his spirit still guards his goal. The Skoptsy have become folkloric bogeymen, their history dissolving into a spooky tale used to explain old money or strange, reclusive neighbors. Their complex theology is forgotten, leaving only the sensational castration and secret gold. One of the most peculiar and specific cultural echoes is the Vaganova Ballet Academy, one of the most famous ballet schools in the world. This is a bit of a historical stretch, but it's a fascinating connection that some have pointed out. A wealthy Skoptsy merchant, a man named Solodovnikov, died without heirs in the late 19th century and left his immense fortune to charity. A significant portion of that money was used to build the Solodovnikov Theatre in Moscow, which later became a major venue for ballet and opera. It's a strange and beautiful irony the wealth generated by a sect that sought to mortify the flesh and deny the body ended up funding an art form that glorifies the human body's beauty, discipline, and grace. The debate among cultural historians today is about the nature of this memory. Is the persistence of the Skoptsy in literature and folklore a genuine reflection of their historical impact, or is it simply that their story is so inherently sensational that it makes for good fiction? Some argue that the Skoptsy tapped into deep-seated anxieties and archetypes within Russian culture: the holy fool, the suffering saint, the secret conspiracy, which is why their story continues to resonate. Others contend that they are remembered not for who they really were, but as a caricature, their complex social and economic history flattened into a simple, shocking tale of the castration cult. They survive. This argument goes, not as history, but as a headline. You walk through a Russian antique market. You see an old icon, a samovar, a piece of pre-revolutionary furniture. It's impossible to know, but any one of these objects could have passed through Skoptsy hands. This samovar might have been polished by a white dove in a communal house. This chair might have been sat in by a helmsman as he planned a secret raid, i.e., the people are gone, but the objects remain, silent witnesses to a faith that burned so brightly and so strangely. The ship is gone, but flotsam and jetsam from its wreck still wash ashore from time to time. Reminders of the voyage. The story is over, but its echoes haven't quite faded away. We've traveled a long, strange road together tonight. We've moved from the frozen fields of the 18th century to the ashes of the 20th. We've witnessed the birth of a radical idea, watched it build a secret empire, and then seen that empire crumble into dust and memory. Now, in the quiet of the journey's end, you find yourself sitting on a metaphorical riverbank, watching the water flow by, and it's time to ask the final question: what was it all for? What does this bizarre, tragic, and utterly human story tell us about the price of belief? The story of the Skoptsy is, at its heart, a story about the search for certainty in a chaotic world. Imagine again that you are that 18th century peasant. Your life is brutal, short, and governed by forces you cannot control: the weather, the harvest, the whims of your landowner, the distance are. Then, a man comes to you with a simple, radical, and absolute answer. He tells you that all your suffering, all the world's suffering, comes from a single source, and he offers you a single, decisive action to eliminate that source forever. It's a terrifying proposition, but it's also a seductively simple one. In a world of shades of grey, he offers you the stark clarity of black and white. The Skoptsy took a fundamental human impulse, the desire to conquer our baser instincts, to be better than we are, and they literalized it. They turned the metaphor into a surgical procedure. They saw the body not as a home for the soul, but as its prison, and they were willing to tear down the prison walls, piece by piece, to set the spirit free. Their entire theology can be seen as a desperate attempt to solve the problem of being human. They wanted to be angels, and they were willing to pay the ultimate price for that angelic status. Their story is also a powerful, if extreme, example of the power of community. They understood that a belief system is not enough. To survive, a faith needs a society. Their ships were not just churches, they were families, insurance companies, and social clubs all rolled into one. They created a world where their members were not just accepted, but celebrated for the very thing that made them outcasts everywhere else. This is the magnetic power of any cult or high-demand group. It offers a home to the homeless, a purpose to the purposeless, and an identity to those who feel they have none. The price of admission might be high, but the benefits of belonging are profound. A strange, final detail to consider is the Skoptsy's unwavering belief in their own rationality. To us, their actions seem like the height of madness, but from their perspective, they were the only sane people in a world gone mad. In their worldview, what was truly insane to perform one final, painful act to guarantee eternal salvation, or to live a life of constant, miserable struggle with sin, only to risk damnation in the end. They saw themselves as the ultimate pragmatists, making a difficult but logical trade, a small piece of flesh in exchange for an eternity of bliss. Of course, the great, unresolved debate that hangs over their entire history is the question of agency versus coercion. For every Skoptsy who freely and fervently chose this path, how many were pressured into it by their families, their community, or their desperate circumstances? For every woman who found liberation in the sect, how many were tragic victims of its misogynistic worldview? Was Selivanov of a holy prophet, a brilliant man, or a madman who genuinely believed his own delusions? The historical record is too fragmented, too biased by the reports of their enemies, to give us a final, certain answer. We are left with a story filled with conviction and contradiction. You stand up from the riverbank and look back at the path you've traveled. The story of the Skoptsy is a testament to the incredible, terrifying, and sometimes beautiful extremes of human faith. It's a reminder that the desire for purity and transcendence can lead to acts of both incredible discipline and incredible violence, especially when that violence is turned inward. They were a paradox: chaste fanatics and shrewd capitalists, gentle brothers and brutal surgeons, victims and visionaries. Their ships have all sunk. Their white city was never built, and their voices have fallen silent. All that remains is their story, A cautionary tale, perhaps, but also a profound and unsettling meditation on what we are willing to sacrifice in our search for God. And so, the journey ends. The echoes of those strange, sorrowful hymns finally fade into the quiet of the night. The sharp edges of the story we've walked through together begin to soften and blur now, like footprints in a gentle, ever-deepening snow. The faces of Selivanov and his white doves, once so clear in the flickering candlelight of our imagination, now recede. They become distant figures in a landscape of sleep, characters in a dream that you are already beginning to forget. There are no more secret meetings to attend, no more frozen roads to travel, no more paradoxes to solve. The weight of that intense and heavy history can be set down now, left behind on the shores of waking thought. You can feel the comforting weight of your own blanket, a gentle anchor in the calm and quiet sea of your room. Listen now, not for the sound of distant chants or whispered prophecies, but for the soft and steady rhythm of your own breathing. Let the vast, white expanse of the Russian winter dissolve into the simple, peaceful darkness behind your eyelids. You have been a perfect witness, a silent traveler through time. And now your watch has ended. The ship of this story has reached its final, quiet harbor, and that harbor is your own deep and restorative rest. There is nothing left to do but to let the gentle current of sleep carry you away into the deep. The end of the article. Good night.